As young students in our social studies classes, I'm sure we've heard the saying before that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. We often hear all the time about how Christopher Columbus discovered these vast continents that we live in, and that's why they were explored. First of all, that's not true. And second of all, that's not what we're talking about today. While we are staying on the topic of European exploration, we're going to be focusing on a totally different explorer. The Age of Exploration, also known as the Age of Discovery, began in the 1400s, and it went on well into the 1600s. It was a period of time when Europeans were exploring the globe. They discovered new routes to India, much of the Far East, and the Americas. The Age of Exploration was an arms race to see who could discover the most the fastest. The root of these explorations is what's known as the 3 Gs: God, glory, and gold. To further explain what these things mean, God is obviously religion. Europeans at this point were primarily Catholic, and they felt like it was their duty to God to convert anyone they came in contact with to Christianity. Gold is obviously money. In order to be a powerful country, and possibly the most powerful country in Europe at the time, you needed one thing. Money. What better way to get money than to have a plethora of gold on hand? The discovery of gold in South America led the Spanish and the Portuguese to be extremely successful in their exploration. Glory is defined as a high, renowned honor won by notable achievements. During the era of exploration, however, glory refers more to the competition between the differing monarchies of Europe. Some kings wanted to claim new territories to strengthen their position in European politics and to increase their power. The Spanish and the Portuguese spent a lot of time building strong ships in order to travel across the Atlantic to the Americas. They mounted weapons on these ships, giving them an advantage on the sea. The era of exploration introduced a lot of new names into history. Arguably some of the most famous being Christopher Columbus, the man who we are taught discovered the Americas; Amerigo Vespucci, the man who named the Americas; Henry the Navigator, who created a navigation school in Portugal; and Ferdinand Magellan, who's known for being the first person to circumnavigate the globe, meaning he traveled the entire circumference of Earth. And that's who we're going to be focusing on today, Mr. Ferdinand Magellan, and the idea that he was the first conquistador to circumnavigate the globe. Before we get into Magellan, though, there's a few key terms that we need to go over so that way you can better understand what I'm talking about. First being circumnavigate. Circumnavigate means to travel all around something, and the prefix circum means round, around, or all sides. Think of the term circumference that you learn in your math classes. If the circumference of a circle means you're trying to find the length of the circle on all sides, then circumnavigate means traveling something on all sides. And that's exactly what Ferdinand Magellan set out to do. He set out to travel the globe, leave from one spot, go all the way around, and return to that same spot he began at. The next term that we need to talk about is conquistador. Conquistador simply means Spanish conqueror. When studying the era of exploration, sometimes we tend to assume that all explorers are conquistadors, and that's just not true. All conquistadors were explorers, but not all explorers were conquistadors. Examples of conquistadors are Hernan Cortez, the man responsible for taking over the Aztec Empire in Mexico, and Francisco Pizarro, the man responsible for taking over the Inca Empire in Peru. And finally, understanding the difference between the Old World and the New World. The Old World consists of Africa, Europe, and Asia. The New World consists of the newly discovered continents of North and South America. Think of it this way: the Western Hemisphere is the New World, and the Eastern Hemisphere is the Old World. Ferdinand Magellan was not a conquistador. Historians argue that Ferdinand Magellan was a conquistador. And once you hear the story of who he was, where he was from, and who allowed him to set sail to explore the world, you might also be confused on if he was a conquistador or not. He was an explorer from Portugal who set out to try to find new trade routes to and from his home country. Ferdinand Magellan was born on February 4th, 1480 in Sabrosa, Portugal, into a family of minor Portuguese nobility. Magellan became a skilled sailor and naval officer in service of the Portuguese crown. King Manuel I refused to support Magellan's plan to reach the Spice Islands by sailing westwards around the American continent, and Magellan did not like that. So facing criminal charges, Magellan left Portugal and proposed this idea of circumnavigation to King Charles I of Spain, who accepted it. Many people in Portugal began to see Magellan as a traitor, and he never returned to Portugal. For his allegiance to the Spanish monarchy, in 1518, Magellan was appointed an admiral of the Spanish fleet and was given command of the expedition, which was the 5-ship Armada of Malacca. He was also made commander of the Order of the Santiago, one of the highest military ranks in the Spanish Empire. Granted special powers and privileges by the king, he led the Armada from Sanlúcar de Barrameda southwest across the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to the eastern coast of South America, and then down to Patagonia. Despite a series of storms and mutinies, the Armada successfully made its way through what is now known as the Strait of Magellan. After successfully passing through the Strait of Magellan, it went into the Mar del Sur, which Magellan renamed to Mar Pacifico, which means the Pacific Ocean. The expedition reached Guam and shortly after the Philippine Islands. Once in the Philippines, Magellan was killed in battle in April of 1521. Under the command of Captain Juan Sebastian Elcano, the expedition later reached the Spice Islands. To navigate back to Spain and avoid being seized by the Portuguese, the expedition's 2 remaining ships split, one attempting unsuccessfully to reach Spain by sailing eastwards back across the Pacific, while the other, commanded by Elcano, sailed westwards via the Indian Ocean and up the Atlantic coast of Africa, finally arriving at the expedition's port of departure and thereby completing the first complete circuit of the globe. Let's back up though and talk more about the death of Ferdinand Magellan. We've covered the fact that he was killed in the Philippines, but let's get into some more gruesome details about what happened during that battle and the days that led up to that battle, shall we? Back in the day of exploration, to travel from Europe to the Americas could take anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months. Travel depended on the wind and the weather, and honestly, luck. So without modern day weather predicting technology that we have now, these voyages relied heavily on luck. For example, Christopher Columbus was rather lucky considering that his first expedition to the New World only took 61 days. Magellan and his crew set sail on September 20th, 1519, sailing west across the Atlantic towards South America. In December, they landed near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. From that point, they sailed south along the coast of South America, searching for a way through the continent to the other side. After about 3 months of searching for a water route through the continent, they were forced to take shelter for the winter. While camping out for 5 months near the port of St. Julian in South America, they were attacked by some Spanish captains: Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, and Luis de Mendoza. Luckily though, Magellan had this little skirmish under control, except for one point where he lost control of 3 of his 5 ships to the captains and their mutineers. Mendoza was killed during this conflict, and once Magellan gained the upper hand again, he sentenced Quesada and Cartagena to be beheaded. It's likely that Magellan did this to prove a point. Don't mess with me. During that same winter, while trying to check out some nearby waters, a storm hit, causing Magellan to lose one of his ships, the Santiago. Fortunately, however, nobody was killed. After their rather eventful winter and stocking up for the remainder of the voyage, the crew resumed their search for a passage to the Pacific in October of 1520. 3 days later, they found a bay that led them into a strait that connected them to the Pacific Ocean. And today, that strait is called the Strait of Magellan. But while exploring this new strait and this new passage to the Pacific, some of the other ships deserted the fleet to go all the way back to Spain. They decided to desert Magellan because they didn't trust him. Because on one hand, he ordered that food be as rationed as possible. But on the other hand, he would often gather his men and tell them not to worry, that there was plenty of food for everyone on board. So he would just go back and forth about the food situation. Eating and having food was not debatable. It's quite literally a life or death situation. And one night, crew members of all ships aside from the Santiago decided to rise up against Magellan and demand that they turn around and head back for Spain. So how did Magellan respond to this? Magellan knew that he still had plenty of people on his side, specifically members on board the ship Victoria. He decided to go to the ship, kill its backstabbing captain, and take over obedience again of the crew, and he killed 2 other captains. Finally, Magellan decided to settle this matter in a court-like system where he was the judge. He ended up pardoning about 50 of the men. Now, don't think he did that just because he was some good Christian dude, because that's not at all why he did that. He needed those men to continue his expedition. Think smarter, not harder, you know? By the end of November of 1520, the crew finally reached the Pacific. Magellan highly underestimated the size of the Pacific Ocean. He expected a short journey to Asia from where they were at, maybe taking 3 to 4 days. Unbeknownst to him, the journey that he thought would only take a few days took 3 months and 20 days. The long journey exhausted their food and freshwater supply, and almost 30 men died. Back to the food issue, considering Magellan only expected this journey to take 3 to 4 days, they obviously didn't pack enough food for 3 months. They were not prepared for just how long this journey truly was going to be. According to a survivor of this voyage, they ate biscuits that were nothing but powder, which were also full of worms and stuff because of rat urine, and they drank unclean yellow water, and ate ox hides and rats. Not only was food of starvation a problem among this voyage, but a disease broke out among the crew. Scurvy. This caused their gums to swell to the point of overwhelming the teeth in both jaws, which also prevented them from eating. So many of the crew members died from this. In the spring of 1521, Magellan and his crew landed on the island of Cebu in the Philippines. Magellan made an allegiance with their king, who converted to Christianity and now also swore allegiance to the Spanish king. With that, the inhabitants of the island were baptized, demolished their idols, and got rid of some of the traditions that they had took part in for generations. Before they left this island, though, tragedy fell before them. Magellan had wanted to seal the alliance with the king of the Cebu island by attacking the neighboring island of Mactan, whose king was an enemy of the Cebu and would not convert to Christianity. So Magellan led his crew ashore, where they started to burn around 30 houses of the locals, who vastly outnumbered them and counterattacked like crazy. Forced back into the sea, Magellan and his men continued to fight while they were knee-deep in the water, but all of their artillery was on their ships, and it was out of reach, therefore it was useless. Poison arrow hit Magellan in the leg, then a spear caught him in the arm, then another spear, and he went down surrounded by the enemy. On April 27, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan died at the age of 41, and his body was never recovered. That afternoon, the king of the Cebu was grieving and was hoping to recover Magellan's remains. So he offered the Mactan's chief a trade of iron and copper for the remains of Ferdinand Magellan, but the chief refused. He intended to keep the body as a war trophy. After Magellan's death, some of his crew members were offered a feast by those on the Mactan Islands, but then they were betrayed and killed as well. Those who were still alive decided to reduce the number of ships they had to 2, so they set 2 of their ships on fire, leaving them with 2. They began the remainder of their expedition on board the ships Trinidad and Victoria. On their way, they chose Juan Sebastian Elcano to succeed Magellan as their new leader. In November of 1521, the remaining crew reached the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, which the Portuguese had already reached earlier via the Indian Ocean. The Moluccas had been Magellan's goal the entire time, but because they sailed west in uncharted territories, they received high honors from King Almanzar. The following month, the ships were loaded with spices and they were ready to head back to Spain. The Trinidad had to stay for repairs to the ship, and eventually they turned east and went back across the Pacific towards Panama. The Victoria continued west towards Africa and beyond to get back to Spain. In the midst of strong winds, it took the Victoria about 7 weeks to get past the Cape of Good Hope around the southern tip of Africa. During these 7 weeks, the crew members were hungry and sick, and they demanded their new leader, Elcano, to land in Mozambique, where the Portuguese had established themselves. Despite the fact that Magellan was Portuguese, this was not a Portuguese expedition. It was for Spain, and Elcano was not about to let his ship and his cargo that he worked so hard for fall into the hands of the wrong people. So he made the crew suck it up so they could return back to Spain. After about 2 months without seeing land and having many of the crew members die, they were forced to land on one of the Cape Verde Islands, which was another Portuguese outpost. But they were in desperate need of clean water. So Elcano sent 13 of his men to try to move the Portuguese governor by explaining their extreme and dire situation. But these men were arrested and the Portuguese tried to attack the Victoria. But Elcano decided he wasn't going to put up with that crap. So he raised his anchor, abandoned his 13 men, and sailed on in despair. On September 6, 1522, emaciated, hungry, sick, and exhausted from fatigue, and after a voyage of nearly 3 years, The Victoria, with Elcano in command, arrived back in Spain with 18 survivors on board. They had completed the first circumnavigation of the globe in history. So there you have it. The true and gruesome story of the first circumnavigation around the globe. It took nearly 3 years. They started with 5 ships and ended with 1. They started with 250 crew members and ended with 18 because people were dying of starvation and having to eat rats, scurvy, drowning, fighting, and being lost at sea. Magellan himself was killed by a poisonous arrow in the Philippines as he was trying to convert the natives to Christianity. I guess you can say Magellan and his crew did succeed in completing the 3 Gs. They converted many of the natives on the lands that they discovered to Christianity. They were able to get spices from the Spice Islands, therefore bringing in money, aka gold. And because they successfully made the circumnavigation, they brought glory to Spain. If you like this video and enjoyed the true and gruesome story of Ferdinand Magellan and the first circumnavigation around the globe, like this video, leave a comment, and please subscribe to my page. Speaking of the 3 Gs, leave a comment of your favorite word that starts with a G. For example, mine is gravy.